Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive into the complex, often turbulent ecosystem of global geopolitics. Today, we are going to analyze a fascinating and highly volatile systemic shift, the accelerating and incredibly messy divorce between the United States of America and the European continent. In the realm of political science and macroeconomics, alliances are not permanent fixtures. They are dynamic equations, constantly balancing variables of power, resources, and mutual benefit. What we are witnessing right now is the breakdown of an equation that has defined the Western Hemisphere for nearly a century. The primary catalyst for this massive geopolitical realignment, the ongoing, highly destabilizing kinetic conflict directed at Iran, spearheaded by the United States and Israel. This specific geopolitical vector is generating a series of unanticipated, unexamined shockwaves that are fundamentally fracturing the transatlantic structural integrity. Before we dissect the current data points of this modern geopolitical fracture, we must calibrate our historical baseline. To understand the present macroeconomic forces, we have to examine a critical node in history that rarely receives adequate analysis within the United States educational apparatus. We must rewind the timeline to the year 1960. This specific temporal coordinate was absolutely monumental in the structural evolution of the global South, particularly the African continent. In 1960, a massive wave of anti-colonial kinetic energy, a true systemic revolution, swept across the African tectonic plates and finally reached the geographic and economic epicenter known as the Congo. This region represented an incredibly dense concentration of natural resources, a vital node in the global supply chain. The Congo was arguably the most resource-dense sector of an already incredibly wealthy continental landmass. However, for decades, it had been subjected to a highly aggressive parasitic extraction mechanism operated by the Belgian colonial government. The thermodynamic flow of wealth moved entirely in one direction, leaving the local ecosystem structurally depleted and economically wasted away. But in 1960, the native population initiated a massive systemic pushback. Much like other regional nodes across that vast continent, they generated enough collective socio-political force to physically and administratively expel the Belgian operators, mirroring the overarching mathematical trend of the era that saw the systematic ejection of German, French, and British colonial frameworks from the African operational grid. Within this highly charged atmosphere of structural reorganization, a highly dynamic, explosively powerful variable emerged within the Congolese socio-political matrix. This variable was a human catalyst, an incredibly effective orator and organizational architect named Patrice Lumumba. For those analyzing the historical data of global liberation movements, his name represents a massive spike in anti-imperial momentum. He experienced only a brief temporal window of operational influence as a very young man. Yet his impact on the geopolitical calculus was profound. If you want to explore the rich, complex background data of this specific historical anomaly, you can look at the sociological modeling presented in literature, such as the highly awarded analytical narrative, the Poisonwood Bible, which essentially maps the trajectory of Lumumba's disruption. However, the established colonial power structures did not simply accept this disruption to their extraction algorithms. The Belgian authorities, utilizing their deep-rooted financial leverage, initiated a counter-revolutionary protocol. They executed a strategy of systemic corruption, purchasing the compliance of specific local nodes within the African network individuals who had been conditioned by long-term colonial presence. A few months after Lumumba ascended to the apex of the newly formed, genuinely autonomous African administrative structure, this coalition of Belgian operators and compromised local assets executed a containment maneuver. They intercepted and arrested Mr. Lumumba, effectively neutralizing the primary catalyst of the Congolese independence vector, demonstrating the brutal inertia of entrenched imperial power systems. What followed was a horrific application of kinetic violence designed to permanently delete this variable from the geopolitical database. The captured leader was transported, subjected to extreme, unquantifiable physical trauma, and ultimately terminated. But the operators of this protocol went a step further in their attempt to alter the historical record. In a grotesque display of chemical data erasure, they dissolved his biological remains in high-concentration acid. The objective was absolute zero. No physical record, no structural remains, no focal point for future systemic rebellion. This was a calculated methodology to ensure that the extraction algorithms could be rebooted without interference, a grim testament to the absolute ruthlessness of mid-century geopolitical economic defense mechanisms. Yet, even the most thorough protocols of erasure can leave behind an anomaly. Just before the final chemical dissolution was executed, a Belgian overseer monitoring the process extracted a single biological artifact, one of Mr. Lumumba's teeth. This microscopic fragment of calcium and enamel survived as an irrefutable data point of historical truth. Decades later, in a highly formalized systemic correction, this singular artifact was returned and ceremonially buried with the honors appropriate for a primary architect of the African independence matrix. Now, 65 years after his targeted termination, he remains a heavily weighted variable in the ongoing equation of anti-colonial momentum, inspiring subsequent generations of operational leaders across the entire continental network. The reason we are analyzing this specific historical data set is because systems of obfuscation eventually decay. After decades of fabricated narratives and informational fakery surrounding this event, a significant systemic correction is occurring. The Belgian governmental apparatus has recently executed an arrest warrant for an aging residual component of their old aristocratic hierarchy, a Mr. Davignon. This individual is now being processed through the judicial system for his functional role in the operational group that executed the termination protocol on Lumumba. This is a fascinating macro-level observation. Historical momentum operates at a remarkably slow velocity, but occasionally the vector aligns with a trajectory that we might scientifically classify as a fractional implementation of absolute justice. This historical case study of imperial overreach and eventual systemic accountability provides the perfect analytical framework for our primary topic. We must now shift our focus from the mid-20th century to the immediate present. The ongoing kinetic conflict involving Iran, currently advancing into its third week of continuous operation, is generating a massive volume of data. You are likely observing a high frequency of informational material regarding the tactical developments. However, as science communicators, our objective is to filter the noise and isolate the most critical macro-level variables. I want to focus on one specific, highly consequential aspect of this conflict, not because it is the sole focal point, but because it allows us to project the long-term historical and geopolitical implications of this structural rupture. Let us examine the immediate geopolitical mechanics. A few days ago, the executive node of the United States, President Trump, transmitted a direct request to the European Alliance Network for operational assistance. The specification was clear. The U.S. apparatus required immediate naval reinforcement and logistical support to counteract a massive disruption in the global supply chain. This disruption was centered on the Strait of Hormuz, a critical capillary in the global energy circulation system. The Iranian operational forces had essentially applied a tourniquet to this strait, effectively closing it off. However, this closure was highly targeted. They maintained the flow for neutral cargo, but implemented an absolute blockade on any maritime assets associated with the United States, Israel, or their immediate strategic partners. This targeted blockade created an immediate tactical deficit for the United States, prompting the transmission of the assistance request to Europe. This transmission placed the executive leadership of the European nations in an extraordinarily high friction scenario. According to the historical behavioral algorithm established over the past half-century, the initial reflex of these European nodes was compliance. Some even initiated preliminary competitive protocols, attempting to optimize their response to the U.S. executive's demands. The United States specifically required access to European military infrastructure and staging areas. Why? Because the traditional U.S. operational bases located within the territories of their Gulf state allies were experiencing catastrophic systemic failure. This failure of the Gulf state infrastructure was not due to a lack of diplomatic authorization from the host nations. Rather, it was a direct result of kinetic countermeasures deployed by Iranian forces, which were systematically neutralizing these bases one by one. The U.S. projection of power was being physically dismantled in the region. Consequently, the U.S. required alternative nodes to maintain operational capacity. However, within a remarkably brief temporal window of 24 to 48 hours, the European behavioral algorithm experienced a massive paradigm shift. After initially calculating a positive response, perhaps offering logistical support or base access, the geopolitical calculus within the European headquarters fundamentally changed, leading to a cascading sequence of systemic rejections. The rejection protocol was initiated first by the administrative node in Spain. This was rapidly followed by Italy, then a period of computational hesitation from Britain before they too outputted a negative response. The cascade continued through the German leadership and ultimately even the French executive branch, historically characterized by a high degree of subservience to U.S. policy parameters, transmitted a definitive refusal. They all systematically denied the U.S. executive's request for integration into the conflict. The feedback loop from the U.S. administration was immediate and highly erratic. In a display of uncalibrated diplomatic behavior, the U.S. executive deployed a barrage of verbal friction, systematically insulting the European leadership and generating a narrative of perpetual U.S. sacrifice versus European systemic parasitism. This erratic output from the U.S. executive branch, utilizing behavioral patterns scientifically analogous to early childhood psychological development, failed to alter the European variables. The structural integrity of the alliance had been breached. The geopolitical divorce between Europe and the United States was officially underway, and the friction coefficients were increasing exponentially. To understand the depth of this fracture, we must look at previous economic stress tests. Prior to this, the European bloc had compromised its economic shielding when the U.S. executive unilaterally deployed massive tariff vectors against them. There was no pre-deployment negotiation phase. It was a sudden, high-impact economic shockwave designed to force compliance through sheer financial gravity. Following the impact of these tariffs, the U.S. administration offered a mitigation protocol, but only under highly coercive conditions. The U.S. proposed a reduction in tariff velocity if, and strictly if, the European system agreed to reroute its energy consumption architecture to purchase highly expensive liquefied natural gas directly from U.S. extraction nodes. Furthermore, this agreement required a massive injection of European capital ranging from $700 to $800 billion directly into the United States economic infrastructure. In macroeconomic terms, the unilateral tariffs were utilized as a blunt instrument to extract direct financial tribute from the European continent. This aggressive economic extraction profoundly degraded the structural bonds of the transatlantic marriage. This massive financial extraction occurred in sequence right after another major systemic shock: the sharp, sudden reduction in U.S. financial and logistical support for the kinetic operations in Ukraine. This abrupt withdrawal of resources forced the European nodes to absorb an unsustainable burden, stimulating intense internal friction and bitter recrimination across the continent. Yet, despite these compounding structural damages, the European leadership apparatus initially maintained their trajectory. We are analyzing the behavior of the dominant political clusters, primarily right-wing administrative bodies currently operating across Europe, with minor statistical outliers like Spain. Their internal socio-political modeling suggested that their optimal strategy for maintaining power was to artificially sustain a hostile external narrative. This strategy involved the systematic demonization of the Russian geopolitical entity, essentially attempting to reboot the operational parameters of the 20th century Cold War. The analytical flaw in this model is profound. The current Russian entity is no longer operating on a socialist economic framework. It has fully integrated into the global capitalist matrix. This critical structural detail was conveniently ignored by European policymakers. Their operational algorithm was simple: amplify the threat vector from Russia, maintain a high degree of subservience to the United States, and hope this generated enough domestic cohesion to survive. And from a purely survivalist perspective, their desperation is quantifiable. Every single one of these European administrative nodes is currently experiencing critical levels of domestic unpopularity. The data points indicating this systemic political failure are readily apparent. Let's analyze the recent municipal elections in the French Republic as a prime example. The political apparatus of the current executive, President Macron, experienced a catastrophic loss of structural integrity, virtually wiped out by surging vectors from both the left and right political spectrums. The temporal viability of these administrations is strictly limited. They are operating in a state of absolute desperation. The critical question for these nodes is, how do you maintain administrative control over a population base that is generating massive amounts of kinetic fury directed at the leadership? The root cause of this fury is mathematically clear. The policy of absolute alignment with U.S. strategic objectives has generated devastating economic blowback. This blowback was most severely felt in the energy sector during the initial phases of the Ukraine conflict. By executing hard sanctions against the Russian energy grid, framing it within a binary moral narrative, the European system effectively severed its own access to low-cost operational fuel. The thermodynamic consequence was immediate. European energy prices experienced a 3 to 100% multiplier. To keep their industrial engines running, they were forced into a high-cost dependency matrix, purchasing exorbitant American liquefied natural gas to replace the previously highly efficient flow of Russian hydrocarbons. When you introduce a 3 to 100% increase in baseline energy costs into an industrial ecosystem, the mathematical output is an unavoidable massive spike in the production cost of all manufactured goods. This exponential rise in production costs triggered a catastrophic failure in global market competitiveness. The international economic network simply ceased purchasing high-priced European outputs. The global supply chain efficiently rerouted its demand vectors toward more optimized manufacturing nodes, primarily the massive industrial capacity of the Chinese infrastructure, and secondarily, the American manufacturing base. The European economic engine was rapidly decelerating, fading into systemic irrelevance. The right-wing administrative nodes could only delay total systemic collapse by projecting a narrative of existential defense, pretending they were the only barrier preventing a theoretical kinetic invasion by Russia across the entire European landmass, while simultaneously showcasing their heavily subsidized alliance with the U.S. executive. The U.S. executive cleverly utilized this European desperation, manipulating the variables to force acceptance of almost any policy directive. However, the initiation of the kinetic conflict with Iran represented a catastrophic miscalculation, a step beyond the maximum structural tolerance of the alliance. The U.S. administration, operating in a closed loop with Israel, unilaterally decided to ignite a massive geopolitical firestorm. Crucially, they bypassed all standard communication protocols. They did not even transmit a preliminary notification to the European nodes regarding this monumental strategic shift. Then, after initiating the conflict, they demanded that the already critically weakened European system absorb the massive political, financial, and military costs of functioning as a junior partner. The European leadership was forced to run a brutal risk assessment algorithm. They were being asked to integrate into a kinetic engagement that lacked transparent strategic objectives that they fundamentally did not desire, and most importantly, that their degraded economic infrastructure simply could not finance. They are currently struggling to maintain basic operational stability in the Ukrainian theater. To process the data honestly, their strategic position in Ukraine is currently outputting a negative trajectory. The absolute last variable their fragile socio-political ecosystems can absorb is integration into another massive, high probability of failure kinetic conflict. The systemic equation yielded only one possible output, and so the European apparatus transmitted a definitive, collective negative response. This collective refusal has generated a radically altered geopolitical map. The United States executive apparatus now finds itself operating in a state of severe systemic isolation. They are executing this massive operational vector entirely alone, or more accurately, in a binary configuration exclusively with the Israeli state. In the complex mathematics of global power dynamics, being tethered exclusively to that specific node actually amplifies the degree of isolation, creating a more hostile operational environment than acting entirely unilaterally. We must now quantify the absolute macroeconomic and geopolitical cost of this uncalculated war. The primary output is profound structural isolation. The European system has now processed the data in the most dramatic fashion possible. The traditional transatlantic operational relationship has reached terminal failure. The divorce protocol has been fully executed. It is characterized by high friction, negative diplomatic outputs, and a complete lack of structural grace. As analysts, we project that the global ecosystem is going to witness the highly chaotic, highly disruptive secondary effects of this messy fracture propagating across multiple geopolitical theaters in the immediate temporal window, months and years to come, if not sooner. The stabilization mechanisms are gone. Meanwhile, the kinetic operations against Iran will continue to generate massive friction within the global energy markets. We are already observing severe blowback within the domestic U.S. economic infrastructure. The logistics and transportation networks are experiencing critical strain. Let's examine the specific data points of this domestic blowback. The thermodynamic disruption of the global oil supply chain has resulted in a 30% increase in baseline consumer gasoline prices within the United States. This is a direct, unavoidable extraction of capital from the average citizen's operational budget just to maintain basic mobility. But the systemic damage goes much deeper into the macroeconomic foundations. If we analyze the commercial logistics grid, the vast network of trucks responsible for transporting biological sustenance and manufactured goods to the domestic distribution centers, we see a critical failure point. This entire network operates on diesel fuel, and the metric for diesel has experienced a catastrophic 40% upward spike. When the primary energy source for the entire logistical distribution network spikes by 40%, the mathematical consequence is absolute and unavoidable. Every single unit of mass that is physically transported to a consumer access point will carry a significantly amplified cost basis in the immediate future. This is the mechanical definition of a compounding inflationary spiral. The kinetic operations thousands of miles away are directly extracting wealth from the domestic consumer base. Simultaneously, the internal labor market is exhibiting signs of severe structural degradation. The official data indicates that 8 million human nodes within the U.S. economy are currently disconnected from the employment matrix. The employment vectors are stagnant, showing zero positive momentum. We are observing a massive convergence of negative economic indicators, escalating energy costs, collapsing logistical efficiency, stagnant labor utilization, and an overarching aggressive inflationary environment. This is the quantifiable output of the current executive administration's policy matrix. Welcome to the operational reality of this specific presidency. Naturally, the executive node is attempting to manipulate the variables to control the output of the upcoming autumnal electoral cycle in November. The administrative algorithms currently being executed represent a mathematical recipe for absolute systemic disaster. Their operational outputs are directly generating their own political termination. Facing this highly probable systemic rejection by the domestic population, the executive apparatus is left with a severely restricted set of operational alternatives. To avoid the inevitable consequences of their own macroeconomic mismanagement, they must either attempt to physically prevent the electoral data collection process from occurring, or they must fundamentally rewrite the foundational source code of the election rules themselves. They are attempting to insulate their administrative node from the highly destructive kinetic feedback generated by their own policy outputs. This is a classic systemic response of a failing power structure attempting to artificially sustain its operational lifespan by corrupting the validation mechanisms. Let us zoom out to the ultimate macro geopolitical perspective. For years, the grand strategic algorithm of the United States was designed to construct a containment perimeter around the rising Chinese economic infrastructure, attempting to isolate it from the global network. However, the data now shows a massive systemic boomerang effect. Through aggressive unilateral actions, economic coercion of allies, and uncalculated kinetic engagements, the entity that is actively being isolated from the global operational matrix is the United States itself. The current conflict with Iran will not be recorded as a strategic victory. Rather, it will serve as a stark historical monument to systemic overreach and imperial decline. This current geopolitical trajectory bears a striking, mathematically verifiable resemblance to the delayed, deeply flawed behavioral corrections of the guilty Belgian government regarding their horrific long-term extraction crimes in Africa. Systems of dominance eventually fracture under their own unsustainable thermodynamic weight. If you find these macro-level systemic analyses and geopolitical data interpretations useful for understanding our complex global environment, please transmit this data to your own operational networks. Share it with friends, neighbors, and co-workers. Distributing this analytical framework is the primary objective of our communication node. And if you have the capacity to inject financial energy into our operational infrastructure to help cover the costs of processing and broadcasting this data, that resource allocation would be profoundly appreciated. Thank you for your time and processing power.